The Crisis of Muslim Civilization by Ali A. Allawi. Chapter 3 The Counter Revolt of Islam. The poisonous culture of imperialism is penetrating to the depths of towns and villages throughout the Muslim world, displacing the culture of Quran, invoking Islam and pretending to be Muslim. They, the leaders of Muslim states, strive to annihilate Islam and they abolish and obliterate the sacred commands of the Quran one after the other. Ayatollah Khomeini in a message circulated to pilgrims in February 1971. The sad dismemberment of Islam's last universal state, the Ottoman Empire, followed within 50 years by the dissolution of the European colonial empires, completed the transformation of Islam's political space into nation states. Even though the mass at large continued to have a powerful affinity with Islam, it was the ruling and mainly secular elites that dominated the new nation states and their political agendas. Islam was pushed, at least officially, well into the background. By the end of 1950s, the world of Islam appeared to be well on its way towards entering the final stages of its transformation according to the norms of a modernizing and industrializing world. The issues were adaptation and adjustment. Muslims could choose theoretically at least their pathways into the modern world, but the choice was not one between Islam and the others. That argument had already been settled, or so it seemed. It was now more a matter of which claims would prevail, those of the Western democracies, the Soviet bloc, or homegrown variants of radical nationalism and socialism. Traditional societies were everywhere in retreat. Bluntly put, Islam was a relic of the past and would survive only as a private faith and a loose set of moral and ethical principles. Mosque going would follow church going, and Islam would succumb to the laws of social, economic, and cultural progress. Islam's irrelevance. It was taken for granted that the Judeo-Christian tradition that framed the development of the West and its intellectual tradition, and that the modern world was an outcome of this legacy. But in the period leading up to the 1970s, there was still doubt regarding the possibility of Islam accepting the essential changes to its character which modernity implied. The traditionalism that was seen to be embedded in Islam's social, religious, and family structures was too deep and ancient to accommodate the demands of modernity. Islam therefore had to be bypassed. Islam was thus a phase and not a platform for the evolution into the modern world of those loosely characterized as Muslims. Of course, in the titanic struggle between the West and the Soviet bloc, the West sought to draw on the political support of Islam, which was by definition opposed to the atheistic aspects of communism. But this did not deflect from the ultimate fate of Islam as a separate pole of power and civilization in its own right. The clash of civilizations would come later. The post-colonial order bequeathed a series of nation-states in the Muslim world that belonged firmly to what was then called the Third World. A variety of militant secularists, radical nationalists, revolutionary socialists, military dictators, and demagogues ruled most of the Muslim world. Islam became subsumed into the Third World, or as Fernand Braudel wrote rather cruelly but accurately, Islam relapsed into that inferno or purgatory of living humanity that we euphemistically call the Third World. The exceptions were the traditional Arab monarchies and the Pahlavi dynasty in Iran. The former had already been consigned to the fate of oblivion for its supposed backwardness and obscurantism. The Iranian Empire, though fancied itself as radical modernizer in the Meiji sense, while at the same time embodying the legacy of Iran's pre-Islamic past. The relationship between Islam and the new radical and modernizing ethos was troubling. By the 1970s, the Mired Muslim nation states had become far stronger and more centralized. The more radical of them were determined to refashion their citizenship citizens' loyalties and identities at breakneck speed. They adopted post war ideologies mainly derived from the European left. These were invariably imposed on the society at large by a dominant intellectual and political class and were frequently applied coercively. Left behind was the moral glue which kept society functioning and the inherent heterogeneity, or in fashionable parlance, pluralism, which was a feature of Islamic societies. The drive to impose a particularistic non-Islamic or even un-Islamic agenda on these new nation states was breathless and sweeping. At first, this affected only a small portion of society, primarily urban dwellers. Thus, the imposition of state ownership on huge swathes of the economies of these countries through nationalizations and expropriations only affected foreign capitalists and the small indigenous business class. Inculcations of the new values of nations, race, and class through the educational system could not amount to much in short term, given that most people existed as rural dwellers on the margins and were mostly illiterate. But it was bound to have a cumulative effect as more people were drawn into the increasing number of modern schools. The crucibles of wars and of economic, social, and cultural struggles extended over a long and continuous period of time were an absolutely essential component of the evolution of modern Western societies. These ingredients were simply not present in the Muslim world when it was subjected to the modernizing schemes of its new elites. The uneven and often shallow roots that these notions put down in Muslim societies coexisted uneasily with the patterns of the past. They were neither completely rejected nor absorbed constructively, leaving an awkward and barren blend of the two worlds as their legacy. This was a far cry from Islam's creative encounter with the Hellenistic and Persian worlds in the early stages of its expansion into a world civilization. At the same time, external threats and internal failures compounded the sense that the unprecedented changes through which Muslim societies were passing were not leading to the promised land of material abundance and to the regaining of Muslims' dignity and strength. The secularizing and modernizing experience of early to mid 20th century turned out to be a prelude to something else. This period, when the transformation of the Islamic world was being confidently predicted, was simply an interregnum. Of course, few people could have predicted the evolution of Islam from the 1970s onwards. The resilience of the Islamic worldview and the turn to extreme radicalism. In the Interregnum, especially during the period after decolonization, political Islam was hardly the force it would later become. Even states which were avidly Islamic, such as Pakistan, which was founded on the theory that Muslims of India were an identifiable nation, were dominated by a secularized elite and by the military. The two largest Islamic political parties of the times, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and the Jamaat-e-Islami in Pakistan, did not seriously threaten the political order. They may have come close to it in Egypt, but the state's ferocious response after the attempt on the life of the Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser in 1954 effectively removed them for a long time as a serious challenge to the military-led regime. There were earlier social action groups which drew their inspiration, including their political ideology, from Islam and from the ideas of Salafist reformers, but their scope and organization were far more constrained. All these earlier groups were studiously non-political, in that they did not directly challenge the colonial authorities and were mainly concerned with warding off threats to Islamic identity of their countrymen in the face of colonial Deracination policies and with a slackening or loss of religious practice and consciousness among them. However, both the Muslim Brotherhood and the Jamaat-e-Islami were a new type of political organization. They evolved an ideology which was mainly premised on the revival of Sharia as the best and the surest way to re-establish the primacy of Islam in state and society. The antidote to modernism, secularism, and nationalism was the return of the Sharia as the fulcrum of a revitalized Islamic political world. A call for the explicit conjoining of Sharia and state became the foundation of the new idea of an Islamic state. This was one of the key components of the worldwide phenomenon that made up the Islamic awakening, which has preoccupied the world for the better part of the last 30 years. The Revolt of Islam. The Revolt of Islam, which was in reality more of a counter-revolution against the cumulative effects of the 2 centuries of retreat, had been gathering momentum during the entire period when Islam's prospects appeared most bleak. At first, the revolt unfolded in small increments, but later in spectacular fashion. These increments took myriad forms, a dramatic popular revolution reminiscent of the great revolutions of history, a successful jihad which helped to bring down the Soviet superpower, the visible and vocal rejection by a large number of Muslims of the verities of secular modernity, the sudden reappearance of Islamic norms and constructs in the public life of Muslims and Islamic societies. Leaders of the Muslim states were shocked by the power of this revitalized Islam and by the threats it posed to the established ruling groups. Governments and societies in the West had to contend with it in their very midst. Communities which had hitherto remained invisible and were written off as hopelessly outside the Zeitgeist sprang into life with a stunning, if often reactionary, vitality. This was especially true of the often angry second generation of Muslim immigrants to the Western Europe who had not been or would not be assimilated. The international order was jolted by the need to accommodate or contain its geopolitical expression, but the Islam which emerged had been fundamentally affected by the experiences of the past decade. The hesitant and defensive Islam, which marked the years when all the structures of the old Islamic order were being dismantled or challenged, appeared to have altered in unimaginable ways. The image of a Muslim world which was thrashing around in order to avoid the fate of irrelevance had become established in the West, but within a decade the entire perspective would change. The Revolt of Islam, which started in the 1970s, was the first event that swept the entire Muslim world since the advent of the modern age. In less than a decade, it put its mark on nearly every Muslim country, as well as on the ever-growing world of Muslims in the West. It was not concentrated in one area, neither did it revolve around a single ethnic or linguistic group. This was a matter of civilization rather than of nationality or culture. The issues that affected each particular component of the global Muslim society might have been profoundly different, but they had a common unifying thread which was played out against a shared background. The accumulation of anguish at nearly 2 centuries of constant retreat and misrule by native elites who were disconnected in fact and spirit from Islam's legacy burst forth in the number of ways and through a number of channels. What appeared to be confusion of thought and a surfeit of reactions was in fact the natural response of an intricate system trying to adjust to serve external and internal jolts which threatened all aspects of its existence and survival. The Revolt of Islam was partly the result of a new generation's emergence onto the political and social landscape. It looked afresh at modernity, Western ideology, and political notions, and reread Islam's legacy and history. A reinvention of Islam, the better to manage the transition of its societies into a position of power and respect in the world, was taking place. But this was not and could not be a total makeover of the civilization, even though the revolutionaries of the time thought that it was. Islam's developing response was taking place in four distinct arenas: ideas, institutions, the social, and the political. In each of these areas, the prompting came from the continuing challenges of the modern world and at the same time from the internal conditions within the Muslim lands themselves. The defensive Islam of the Interregnum could not offer a basis for counterattack. The call for a return to the faith was an insufficient retort. The obvious seeping of vitality, power, and authority from the world of Islam, realization of the absence of the divine from modern Western experience required a sea change in the perspectives of Muslims if they were to come to terms with its consequences. The self-serving platitude that the West was materialist while the East was spiritual did not offer a program either for material or spiritual advancement. At best, it might have encouraged an increased piety or a self-absorbed religiosity. At worst, it led to the vague thinking which sought to spiritualize Western institutions without understanding the well springs of these institutions and their anchoring in the specific historical experience of the West. To some extent, this was recognized by the reformers of the late 19th and the early 20th centuries. They, with only a limited exposure to and understanding of the West, sought to reinterpret the basis of Islamic knowledge and experience so as to come to terms with what was perceived to be the West's strengths, its rationality and science. But the Islamic thinkers and reformers of the Interregnum were operating in an entirely different landscape. They had to contend with the ruling classes who were committed not only to modernizing but often to westernizing their societies. These elites, unlike those of the 19th and early 20th centuries, mainly rejected the possibility that Islam would provide a gateway into the modern world. Moreover, they adopted notions such as nationalism both as a governing ideology and as an alternative to the Islamic loyalties of their people. Thus, the Islamic thinkers of the period of the Interregnum were doubly challenged. They had to confront both this internal reality, where Islam was often rejected as an organizing principle for the society, and a purely external challenge, which emanated from the Western and communist worlds. A vanishing vitality. The Interregnum thinkers were greatly affected by their direct encounter with colonialism and with Marxist determination. The colonial experience crystallized the civilizational aspects of the triumph of the West. This triumph was seen in stark terms when the realities of conquer and conquered were laid side by side and measured against each other. Islam, or at least its civilizational component, was found wanting. This was the position of the Algerian thinker, modern philosopher, and educationalist Malik Benabi, 1905 to 73. He evolved a complex theory of the rise and fall of civilizations and set the West's dominance over Islam in terms of the Muslims' propensity to allow their minds to be colonized. His thesis of colonizability, probably more so than any other systematic Islamic thinker of the modern period, Benabi brings the focus of civilizational regeneration squarely back to man as an individual actor and agent. His concerns were unusually non-political. He was one of the few thinkers of the time whose constructs were not directly related to the seizure of political power or control of the state. He was the last of the pre-radical thinkers of his generation, being overtaken in influence influenced by the rise of the ideologies of political Islam and its proponents. Apart from the originality of his thought, he stands out among his peers through his willingness to delve into individual conduct and perception as a precondition for successful societal and cultural regeneration. According to Benabi, all civilizations arise as a result of a religious principle which articulates the contours of the civilization. Religion organizes the vital forces of human beings and moves them from being dominated by their animal drives and survival instincts to a level where they are tamed under the spiritual domain of religion. In Islam, this phase corresponded to the prophetic period and its immediate aftermath. It culminated in what Benabi called the Age of the Spirit. As the civilization expands, it also increases in complexity and resources, opening the second stage of civilizational progress, the Age of Reason. This phase weakens the original religious impulse, and society begins to lose its commitment to the moral precepts of its religion base, even as it extends itself materially and intellectually. Nature reasserts its control over the individual and society, gradually reducing the civilization's vitality and leading to its decay and retrogression. Societal bonds gradually unravel, ending the civilizational cycle. Intelligence is constantly the function of the spirit. When the latter no longer possesses its purity, the former no longer has all its depth, Benabi wrote. Benabi avers that there are two phases which mark the evolution of mankind: pre-civilizational and the post-civilizational. In the former, human beings have the potential for creating a civilization such as the pre-Islamic Arabs. In the post-civilizational phase, human beings have lost the capacity for civilizational action. Muslims are now in a condition where their civilizational power is exhausted. They are entrapped in the deadly syllogism. We are Muslims, therefore we are perfect, which tends to sap all perfectibility in the individual by neutralizing in him all concerns for attaining perfection, he wrote. Society breeds immobilized individuals who are mired in their mediocrity, inaction, and pride. These form the new moral elite of post-civilizational Islamic man. Moral paralysis leads to intellectual paralysis. Thought petrifies in a world which no more reasons, since its reasoning has no longer a social object. It traces back that period of the beginning of Muslim decline to the collapse of the Almohad dynasty in North Africa and Spain in the 11th century. That point in time marks an inflection in the evolution of Islamic society, whereby the civilizational elan goes into reverse. Muslims begin to lose their creative vitality, partly because of their inordinate success. In some respects, Benabi's observation mirrors Gibbon's remarks on the decline of the Roman Empire. The decline of Rome was the natural and inevitable effect of immoderate greatness. Prosperity ripened the principle of decay. The cause of the destruction multiplied with the extent of conquest, and as soon as time or accident had removed the artificial supports, the stupendous fabric yielded to the pressure of its own weight. Benabi's thesis is not entirely cyclical, for it presupposes that effort would be needed to bring post-civilization man back to his pre-civilization potential. The imprint of the great 14th century Muslim philosopher of history, Ibn Khaldun, is clearly here. Whatever one thinks of Benabi's theory of the rise and fall of civilizations, it is his assessments as to what the conditions are for Islam's civilizational revitalization that are the more apt. He establishes a formula whereby civilizational action is composed of a tirade of elements: the human factor, the resources at society's disposal, and the effects of time. The catalyzing agent of all three is the religious drive. Bernabe's theory applies to all civilizations, and it presents the Judeo-Christian tradition as the central element of the West's civilization. The combination of the necessary elements for civilizational action becomes inert when a civilization has lost its catalyzing energy. The loss of the religious drive in Muslim societies, specifically the loss of moral precepts for societal and individual action, has driven Muslim societies to become entirely dependent on the products and processes of other civilizations' works. Dependence and impoverishment are the inevitable consequences. The building of human relations in functioning societies follows a related pattern. The socialized individual, a person, shakhs in Arabic, joins the universe of ideas and matter to form the components of society. Bernabe lays a great stress on the endurance of vital ideas as the main element in the revitalization of broken societies. He gives as an example the rise of Germany from the ashes of war, when the element of matter or resources had been destroyed. However, ideas by themselves are insufficient for the survival of societies if human bonds have been weakened. The overwhelming of Muslim Andalusia by the less intellectually developed Spanish Catholics was due to the latter's greater advantage in social cohesion. In a most telling metaphor, Bernabe compares modern Islamic societies to a rider who has lost control over the stirrup and failed to recapture it. Islamic civilization, he writes, is blown off course by contradictory and conflicting ideas. On the one hand, the ideas which put it face to face with the problems of technological civilization without establishing real contacts with the roots of that civilization, and on the other, the idea which link it to its original cultural universe without embracing the archetypes of this universe. A key element in Bernabe's construct is the idea of colonizability, or the propensity to accept uncritically the norms, values, and precepts of dominant or conquering civilizations. He considers Islamic societies in their post-civilization phase to be particularly vulnerable to this change. Muslims would not have been so thoroughly imbued with Western notions had they not already been prone to accept them. Civilizations that are overwhelmed have already been defeated before the direct encounter with the dominant powers ever takes place. Their vitality has been lost and they are easy prey. The dominant civilization need not actually embark on physical conquest to achieve its objectives. The colonized society and, more importantly, the colonized individual have succumbed to the norms of the conqueror, often with little or no resistance. Bernabe was, of course, greatly influenced by the Algerian experience, but his thesis is presented as a universally valid construct. Nevertheless, Bernabe was not uniformly pessimistic about the future of Islamic civilization. The seeds of rebirth were scattered, but they often fell on ill-prepared ground. The efforts of the 19th century reformers and modernizers have left little of consequence, but at least they kept open the possibilities for reversing the process. The reformist movement did not know how to transform the Muslim soul or to translate into reality the social function of the religion, but it did succeed in breaking the static equilibrium of the post-civilization Muslim epoch. He wrote, "The call to return to the pristine past of early Islam did not, however, lead to a return to the consciousness of the early Muslim, but to the theologies and disputations of medieval Islam." Bernabe also had profound observations to make on the culture of rights and demands, which had displaced the sense of duty and obligations inherent in Islam. Even projects that may appear to entail a return to Islamic life, such as the call to reinstate the Sharia, or are couched as political demands irrespective of whether the individual applies the conditions of Sharia or to his or her own conduct. The Muslim world becomes denuded by grand schemes and projects which are then expressed as political demands, while the need is for a series of smaller, even personal changes in perspective and behavior, which may collectively produce an environment more conducive to societal regeneration. It's from this perspective that Banabi presents his proposals for the recreation of the moral Islamic person through a broad cultural program. He presents culture as a unifying force which allows entirely disparate people to share in a common response to matters that affect society at large. He recognized, of course, that the problems of Muslim societies are partly caused by the discontinuities which exist between the culture of the elites and that of the common man. Discontinuities which over time have widened to the point where the two sets of people inhabit different worlds, often not even sharing a common language. Once again, his reference point is the North African countries, which emerged out of the French colonial empires and their francophone elites. But his arguments can easily extend to other parts of the Muslim world, where the issues of language and cultural expression have yet to be dealt with. Banabi's sensibilities never reached a wide audience in the Muslim world, mainly because his program was not couched in political terms. His concern was the development of an aesthetic sensibility in Muslim mind was lost on his contemporaries. His understanding of work was in terms of achievement, pride, and excellence, but all this was disconnected from the desperate daily grind that most people had to struggle through. The stultifying routine of overstaffed bureaucracies or the mad rush to accumulate wealth legitimately or otherwise, whether the opportunity afforded itself. To him, pride in craftsmanship, deep knowledge of the structures of the professions and of the workings of productive organizations, attention to detail and method, diligence and perseverance in application were the essential preconditions for the successful transplantation of modern economies into the Muslim world. But this ran counter to the mechanistic or credential-obsessed understanding of work and status which permeated the post-colonial Muslim world. Banabi's critique was exceptionally apt, but it had to fight for attention with the Islamic world, which was more interested in projects for seizing through political action the commanding heights of power as a gateway to the civilization's revival.